Sarah Martinez stood in line at the grocery store, her faded military uniform drawing unwanted attention. The fabric had seen better days, worn thin at the elbows and knees from years of service. Small patches covered areas where the material had torn, each one a memory of missions she could never forget. The colors had faded from the desert sun, and the creases no longer held sharp lines like they once did. But it was clean, pressed as best as she could manage. It was all she had. Behind her, two young men in expensive gym clothes whispered and snickered. Sarah heard every word. They pointed at the patches on her sleeves, mocking the wear and tear. One of them made a comment about stolen valor, suggesting she must have bought the uniform from a thrift store. The other laughed loudly, saying real soldiers would never let themselves look so shabby. Sarah's jaw tightened, but she kept her eyes forward. She had learned long ago that some battles were not worth fighting. The cashier, a teenage girl with bright pink hair, gave Sarah an uncomfortable look as she approached. Sarah could see the doubt in her eyes, the same judgment she had faced countless times since returning home. She pulled out her worn wallet, counting exact change for the bread and milk she was buying. Every penny mattered now. Her disability payments barely covered rent and medication for the injuries that plagued her daily. More people began to notice. A woman in designer sunglasses pulled her children closer as if Sarah might be dangerous. An elderly man shook his head disapprovingly. The whispers grew louder. Someone mentioned that real veterans deserved respect, implying that Sarah was not among them. Another voice suggested she was probably homeless, using a costume to beg for sympathy. The shame burned in Sarah's chest, but she stood tall, her spine straight, shoulders back. Just as she had been taught, Sarah's unit tag was barely visible under her collar, faded like everything else. The 101st Airborne Division patch on her shoulder had lost most of its color. She had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, leading supply convoys through the most dangerous routes. Her team had delivered food, medical supplies, and ammunition to outposts under constant threat. She had saved lives, lost friends, and carried scars both visible and hidden. But none of these people knew that. All they saw was a woman in a worn uniform, struggling to buy groceries. They saw poverty and assumed deception. They saw weakness and assumed fraud. Not one of them stopped to wonder why the uniform was so worn, what battles it had survived, or what stories it could tell. Sarah finished paying and took her small bag, preparing to walk through the gauntlet of stares and whispers. She had faced enemy fire before. She could handle this too. The automatic doors slid open just as Sarah turned to leave. A tall figure in an immaculate dress uniform entered the store, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. Brigadier General James Cooper was there for a quick stop before heading to a ceremony across town. His chest displayed rows of ribbons and medals, each one representing years of service and sacrifice. He carried himself with the authority of someone who had commanded thousands of troops. His eyes swept the store with practiced efficiency, taking in everything at once. That's when he noticed the commotion near the checkout line. People were staring at someone, whispering with faces full of judgment and scorn. The general's expression hardened. He had seen this before, too many times. Veterans struggling, being mocked by people who had never served a day in their lives. Then he saw her. The woman in the faded uniform, holding a small grocery bag, her head high, despite the humiliation surrounding her. General Cooper's trained eye immediately caught details others had missed. The way she stood, the discipline in her posture, the careful press of her uniform despite its condition. This was no imposter. This was a soldier. His gaze dropped to her shoulder, searching for identification. The faded 101st Airborne patch made him pause. Then his eyes found the barely visible unit tag near her collar. His breath caught. He knew that unit. He had commanded the broader division that unit fell under during his time in Afghanistan. Those convoys had been legendary for their bravery. Running supplies through hellfire to keep forward operating bases alive. The general's jaw clenched as he heard another snicker from the young men behind Sarah. One of them was now filming her on his phone, probably planning to post it online with some mocking caption. The woman with the designer sunglasses was explaining loudly to her children about fake soldiers. and why they should never pretend to be something they're not. The cruelty of it struck him like a physical blow. General Cooper changed direction. Walking straight toward Sarah, his boots clicked sharply against the tile floor, a sound that carried authority and purpose. Conversations began to die down as people noticed him approaching. His uniform was impossible to ignore, the stars on his shoulders gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Heads turned, backs straightened, and the mocking whispers faded into confused silence. Sarah heard the footsteps and turned, coming face to face with the general. For a moment, pure panic flashed through her. She knew her uniform was a mess. She knew she looked nothing like a proper soldier should. She braced herself for another humiliation, this time from someone who actually had the authority to question her. But General Cooper did not question her. Instead, he came to attention and rendered a crisp, formal salute. His hand moved with perfect precision to his brow, his body rigid with military protocol. The gesture was unmistakable, filled with respect and recognition. Every person in that store who knew anything about the military understood what they were witnessing. Generals did not salute randomly. They certainly did not salute imposters or homeless people in costume. Sarah's eyes widened in shock. For a heartbeat, she could not move, frozen by disbelief. Then training took over. Her hand snapped to her forehead in an answering salute, her body falling into the familiar posture despite the aches and pains that plagued her. For that moment, she was not a struggling veteran in a worn uniform. She was a soldier again, standing before a superior officer with pride. "Sergeant Martinez," the general said, his voice carrying clearly through the now silent store. He had read her name tag, faded as it was. "It's an honor to see you again. Your service with the 101st Convoy teams was exemplary. Your unit saved countless lives, including some of my own people." The grocery store had become absolutely silent. Every eye was locked on the scene unfolding. The young men who had been mocking Sarah stood frozen, their faces draining of color. The woman with the designer sunglasses had gone pale, her hand covering her mouth. The elderly man who had shaken his head now stood straight, his own hand moving unconsciously toward his forehead in respect. Even the teenage cashier stared, her previous doubt replaced with awe. Sarah's throat tightened with emotion. She had not expected this. Not today. Not ever. "Sir," she managed to say, her voice steady, despite the tears threatening to fall. "Thank you, sir." General Cooper lowered his salute and stepped closer, his voice dropping slightly but still audible to those nearby. "I reviewed casualty reports from your sector. Your convoy took fire 17 times in 8 months. You lost 3 team members but never failed to complete a mission. Forward Operating Base Phoenix would have fallen without your deliveries. The soldiers there called your team the Ghosts because you always appeared when hope was gone." Sarah nodded slowly, memories flooding back. The dust, the heat, the constant fear, the explosions that rocked their trucks, the faces of her friends who never made it home. Miguel, who loved to sing despite his terrible voice. Chen, who showed everyone pictures of her newborn son before every mission. Jackson, who had saved Sarah's life by throwing himself over an IED. The medals she had been awarded sat in a box somewhere. Unable to be displayed because she had no home to display them in, the general turned to face the crowd that had gathered. His expression had shifted from warmth to stern disapproval. "This soldier," he said, his voice sharp enough to cut steel, "wore this uniform in service to a nation that clearly does not deserve her sacrifice. She drove through enemy territory while people like you slept safely in your beds. She carried supplies to soldiers under siege while you complained about traffic on your morning commute." The young man with the phone slowly lowered it, his hand shaking. His friends stared at the floor, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Shame radiated from them in waves. The woman with the designer sunglasses gathered her children quickly, her face burning red as she rushed toward the exit. Others in the store began to shift uncomfortably, realizing they had participated in something ugly. "This uniform is worn because it has been through hell," General Cooper continued, gesturing to Sarah's faded patches. "Every tear, every faded thread, every repair represents a sacrifice you cannot imagine. When you mock a veteran's appearance, you mock every moment they spent protecting your freedom. You mock their wounds, their losses, their trauma. An older veteran near the back of the crowd wearing a Vietnam War cap began to clap. Slowly at first, then with more conviction. Others joined in, the applause building until it filled the store. The teenage cashier was crying now, her own hands coming together in rapid claps. The store manager appeared from the back, taking in the scene with wide eyes before adding his own applause. Sarah stood there, overwhelmed. She had not cried when she was injured. She had not cried at her friends' funerals. She had not cried through the long, painful recovery or the night sleeping in her car. But now, standing in a grocery store with a general saluting her and strangers applauding, the tears finally came. They rolled down her cheeks as years of pain, shame, struggle poured out. General Cooper placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of support and solidarity. "Where are you staying, Sergeant?" he asked quietly, concern evident in his voice. Sarah hesitated, then answered honestly, "My car, sir." For the past 3 months, the general's face hardened with anger, though not at her. "That ends today. I'm making some calls. There are resources, programs that should have found you already. The system failed you, but I will not." He pulled out his phone, already scrolling through contacts. Within 20 minutes, the store had been transformed into an impromptu support center. The store manager had offered his office for privacy. General Cooper had made a series of phone calls, each one more forceful than the last. He spoke with veterans organizations, housing programs, and fellow officers who owed him favors. He used every bit of influence his rank provided, refusing to accept any excuses or delays. The old Vietnam veteran approached Sarah, introducing himself as Frank. He owned a small apartment building and had a vacant unit. "No charge for the first 3 months," he insisted, waving away her protests. "You served, that's payment enough. After that, we'll figure out something affordable." His eyes were wet with tears as he shook her hand. He understood what she had been through, the invisible wounds that hurt more than the physical ones. The woman who had been so quick to judge earlier returned, her designer sunglasses now hiding red, puffy eyes. She approached Sarah hesitantly, her children behind her. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I was so wrong. So incredibly wrong. Please forgive me." She pressed several $100s in cash into Sarah's hand before Sarah could refuse. "For groceries. For whatever you need. It's the least I can do." Even the young men who had mocked her approached, though they could barely look at her. "We're sorry, ma'am," one of them said, his voice small and ashamed. "We deleted the video. We didn't know. We didn't think," the other added. "Thank you for your service. We mean that, really." Sarah accepted their apologies with grace, understanding that ignorance was not always malicious. Many people simply did not understand what veterans went through, both during and after service. They saw movies and thought they knew war. They saw parades and thought they understood sacrifice. The reality was far different, far harder, and far lonelier than anyone could imagine without living it. General Cooper finished his calls and returned with news. "Sergeant Martinez, effective immediately. You have access to veteran housing through the VA. I've also arranged for you to meet with a veterans advocate who specializes in disability claims. Your benefits should be higher than what you're receiving. We're going to fix this." He handed her a business card with his personal number. "You call me if you need anything. And I mean anything. I don't care what time it is or what day it is. You are not alone anymore. That's an order." 3 months later, Sarah stood in her new apartment, looking at the walls she had finally been able to decorate. Photos of her unit hung in frames honoring those who had not made it home. Her medals were displayed properly, no longer hidden in a box of shame. She had furniture now, donated by various veterans organizations and community members who had heard her story. The refrigerator was full. The bills were paid. She even had a job lined up, working with a company that specifically hired veterans. Her uniform hung in the closet, cleaned and properly repaired by a professional military tailor who had refused payment. Next to it hung a new uniform, provided through the Veterans Program. But Sarah kept the old one. It represented her journey, both the service and the struggle afterward. She would never forget what it felt like to be mocked and dismissed. That memory would drive her forward in her new mission. Sarah had started volunteering with homeless veteran outreach programs. She knew how to spot the signs now, the subtle indicators that someone was struggling. She knew the shame that kept them from asking for help, the pride that made them suffer in silence. She had been there, lived through it, and now she could help others find their way out. General Cooper had kept his word, checking in regularly. He had also used Sarah's story, with her permission, to push for better veteran support systems. Changes were being made, slowly but surely. Training programs for VA staff, increased funding for housing assistance, better coordination between military discharge and civilian support services. Sarah's humiliation in that grocery store had sparked something larger than either of them had anticipated. The young men who had mocked her had also changed. They had reached out through social media, asking if they could volunteer with veteran organizations. Their ignorance had been transformed into action. They now spent weekends helping veterans move into new housing, organizing donation drives, and educating their peers about the challenges veterans faced. Shame had become purpose. Sarah received letters from people across the country, veterans who had seen news coverage of that day in the grocery store. They shared their own stories of struggle, of feeling invisible, of wearing uniforms that were no longer pristine. She answered every letter, offering encouragement and resources. She had become a voice for those who felt voiceless, a symbol of both the problem and the solution. On this particular evening, Sarah prepared for a speaking engagement at a local high school. She would wear her old uniform, the worn one that had caused such judgment. Students needed to see it, to understand that service was not always glamorous. They needed to hear that veterans were not always parade-ready, that struggle did not diminish sacrifice. She would tell them about the convoy runs, about her friends who died, about sleeping in her car, and about the general who saw past appearances to recognize honor. As she buttoned up the faded uniform, Sarah smiled at her reflection. The patches were still worn, the colors still faded, but now she wore them with confidence, knowing that every imperfection told a story worth sharing. She was no longer ashamed. She was proud not just of her service, but of her survival. She had faced enemy fire and civilian cruelty, and she had overcome both. That made her stronger than she had ever been in combat. Her phone buzzed with a text from General Cooper. "Proud of you, Sergeant. Keep fighting the good fight." Sarah smiled and grabbed her keys. She had a new mission now, and she would complete it with the same dedication she had shown in Afghanistan. No veteran would face what she had faced, not if she could help it. The war might be over, but her service had just begun.